You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and editor of the EV-focused sister site, The Driven, without my headphones because I'm in the studio, but someone's taken the mixer, so I'm just doing it on my laptop. So there. And David, you've still got your headphones? You've still got all your equipment?
I have got my equipment, Giles. Hello to all our listeners, wherever they may be, and hopefully not too many in Sydney with all this rainy weather. And finally, as we move into winter, no doubt spot electricity prices are going to start moving up. But we've got not one, but two great interviews this week, don't we, Giles? Plus on top of that, we've got some really great news that we probably haven't made enough of.
Yeah, no, that's probably true. Yeah, look, we've got one fantastic interview and we've got an excerpt of another fantastic interview. We have, you've been speaking to Tim Washington from Jet Charge about all issues with EV charging. Anne Delaney, who hosts the Switched On podcast, had a fantastic interview and visit with Robert Clifford, the chairman and boss of Incat in Tasmania. It's remarkable what we didn't know about them and how much they're doing in revolutionising electric shipping, particularly with these giant electric ferries that they're building for Uruguay and also Scandinavian customers. And I've also been at the Energy Efficiency Conference, and which is one reason I didn't join you for the Tim Washington interview. So,
and Trump, well, shall we? How do you want to proceed, Giles?
Well, let's have a listen to your interview with Tim Washington, and we'll come back with the other bits and news of the week. So here's you and Tim Washington from Jet Charge.
Tim Washington, co-founder and CEO of Jet Charge. Thanks very much for joining Energy Insiders again.
Good to be with you.
I thought it was timely to have a little chat about charging infrastructure. I've been on a something of a little mission to try and think that Australia should have a fully integrated plan for decarbonising, and EV charging certainly is part of that plan. I just wondered if maybe we could just start with a little bit of background about how you actually got into the EV charging space. It's not at the time you started it, I imagine, the career that everyone thought they would be pursuing.
Certainly not. No, it was a long time ago. Goodness, it was 14 years ago now that we started getting into EV charging. So it feels like a very different world in some ways, and actually not so different in other ways. But we started adding home charging for Tesla, and essentially I had just come out of another business, trained as a lawyer, but decided to kind of follow my nose in terms of what got us interested, and EV charging, electric vehicles was the thing that we decided to pursue. Started in home charging with Tesla in Melbourne and kind of grew the business from there to who we are today. And today, whilst we still do a lot of home charging, it's a smaller part of our business. And most of our focus is on large-scale bus, truck, fleet electrification, as well as large-scale public charging.
I want to come on to the fleet electrification because long-distance diesel replacement is a particular hobby of mine this year, one of my themes. But I thought we might just start giving your background and basically having lived with the EV charging sector in Australia or business since it started. Maybe we could just talk about the passenger car side of things. It seems to me when I looked into it that on the one hand, Australia looks terrible on most global metrics in terms of EV chargers. And on the other hand, because we do have a lot of detached houses, home charging still, for many people, much of the time, actually mitigates against that. What do you think?
I mean, I agree with that. We have one of the highest penetrations of off-street parking in the world, sitting at around 70% of Australians have access to some form of off-street parking. So that might be a garage, it might be a carport, it might just be a driveway. Then on top of that, around about 30% of us live in either apartments or houses with no off-street parking. Of course, within apartments, you can electrify those apartments, but just due to the nature of owners' corporations and the bureaucracies that come around with that, the number of apartment electrification projects is far dwarfed by the stock of apartments. And so the good news stories we hear are fantastic, and I support those, but they are a drop in the ocean of how many buildings out there that need to be electrified. And so a lot of people in apartments tend to charge in public. But if you think about it like this, whilst 70% of Australians have access to off-street parking, 30% don't. And out of that 70%, around about 10% of charging sessions for the average person with home charging still occurs in public. So that might be road trips, that might be opportunity charging, destination, whatever it is. And so just very roughly, between 35 to 40% of all charging is probably going to be done in public at scale, which means that I think getting people with garages and driveways into electric vehicles is the easy first part and something that I promote. Let's get the easy stuff done first. But there is absolutely no doubt that a robust public charging system is going to be required to electrify the required 40% of charging that's going to occur on those networks.
Yes, and I'm always was very influenced by Kurt Lewin's force field theory, which sort of said that what changing people's minds was they had positive and negative forces towards change. And it seems to me that range anxiety and charging is by far the dominant negative thing that people have who don't drive EVs, and even sometimes like me who do have EVs.
Yes, and look, I agree with you. Like I was on a road trip just this weekend. Actually, we went camping and we had to drive like 400 kilometers. And I had to charge in between. And, you know, as someone who knows the charging infrastructure landscape pretty inside out, I've got like one of these, I guess, smaller Chinese-made brands, right? And I went to charge on a very well-known network that is supposed to be extremely reliable, but the handshake didn't work. And there was a moment where I said, wow, the handshake's not working. I have to go find another charging station. Now, 5-6 years ago, or even 3 years ago, I think my options would have been limited, but there were another two in that town. So I just went to another one. But even for someone like me, that feeling of infrastructure that doesn't quite work is still sinking because I've got 2 kids in the back of the car.
I'm well aware of that. 2 kids is a hassle, but believe me, your wife in the car who's just giving you the look is possibly what the kids I can deal with, you know.
Goodness.
And I've had to charge, at a caravan park when we went bicycle riding in Victoria, but that was years ago, and there is now an EV charger there. So I think, Tim, when I looked at the overall statistics, it turns out that in terms of public charging, we've got something like 1 charger for every 50 EVs. And of course, the EV sales, it seems to me, are increasing a lot faster than the number of chargers. And I think if you look at the better areas around the world, which possibly have less home charging, it's like 1 charger for every 10 EVs. So we're a long way behind, aren't we still?
We're a long way behind, but I think the actual answer is far more nuanced than that. I think what we've seen in some markets is actually an overbuild of charger infrastructure due to government policy or due to aggressive companies going out there and quote unquote land grabbing what they could. And what that's resulted in is, I think, a good service on the face of it for EV drivers. They've got a lot of places they can charge. But what's happened is that the profitability and the business case for public charging for all of these businesses is terrible. And so if you look behind the scenes, they're really struggling in a lot of these jurisdictions because they simply do not have the utilization required to pay back the infrastructure. Now, a typical EV driver might go, well, that's not my problem, that's their problem. But that's only for the short term, because in the long term, that will be the EV ecosystem's problem, because you're going to have stranded assets, you're going to have companies that go broke, you're going to have companies that can't raise money, and you're going to basically end up with a patchwork of infrastructure that's unreliable. What you're really looking for is a balanced approach where there are enough charging stations for drivers, but that there's not so many that you can't actually make a business out of it. And I think what we have in Australia is one that absolutely skews towards not having enough chargers. But I also think that it's actually not so much, I don't think, anymore a matter of having enough sites, especially in highways. Like I feel like a lot of the regional towns, the highways, I actually think we do have pretty reasonable charger infrastructure. Yes, there are black spots, but if you look at the overall traffic flow of where 95% of people go, for those places, I think they're pretty well serviced. I think where we're not well serviced is the number of bays per site.
This is what I think, and I'm sure I drive in the country myself, regional New South Wales, regional Victoria, as well as up and down the Pacific Highway. And, I tend to go to a place which will have 10 chargers because I'm pretty sure that someone's going to be finishing their charge or there'll be an empty stall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the current wisdom among most EV drivers. And I think the reason why everyone other than Tesla doesn't roll out 8 to 12 bays for every site. There are some sites where the other CPOs will roll out a high number of bays. But I think the reason is because they're worried about utilization. If I know everybody talks about, but during Easter and long weekends and all of that stuff, it gets a bit congested. But the reality is that 95% of the time, the parking lots sit relatively emptier. And so it's similar to the grid, right? If you build only for the maximum events when everyone's got their air conditioning on, then yes, we can do it, but people have to be prepared to pay more. And so I think but nevertheless, the wisdom is that if you have more car bays, you're more likely to get custom. Now, I do wonder whether that would change in the future if there were a change to charging speed. And I think that's part of the challenge.
Yes, it is. But I'm not sure which order to take this. And you've mentioned charging speed, and it's certainly something that I want to come on to, and that's also related to infrastructure. But just in terms of the economics of bays and chargers, let's talk about that just for a moment. Conventionally, one bay, one like little conversion from the grid. Basically, you need a utilization of 20% or something.
20%,
and then you're going to break even or something like that.
Yes.
Now, I've been looking myself at models like Chemtron that seem to have one central station, and then you have the charging points that sort of flick off that. Can that improve the economics at all?
Yeah, I think you're talking about Chempower.
Chempower, excuse me.
Yeah, that's okay. Yes, so Chempower is absolutely one brand that has, and they did a lot of the pioneering for satellite systems outside of Tesla, because obviously Tesla was the first satellite charging system that I've seen. But
just for people that don't understand, talk to me about what a satellite system is.
So traditionally when people imagine a charging station, they think of a box with a cable that comes out the front of it. And in that situation, all of the electronics that are required to deliver really fast charging to your vehicle are contained in that box. The idea is that obviously the disadvantage of that is that if you wanted to do more than 2 bays, you have to have more than one box, and you have to replicate a lot of the power electronics across each parking space. What satellite systems are, which is the Tesla supercharging network, which is Chempower, which is a number of other brands, is they put all of the power electronics that is required to turn AC to DC electricity for the vehicles into a separate, what they call cabinet. They traditionally call it just a cabinet, very, boring name. And then they call the dispensers satellites. So the dispensers essentially sit as cables and cable holders for your vehicle. So you're right in the sense that if you separate out the cabinet and the satellite, you can have more satellites per cabinet, typically anywhere between 6 to 12. But the problem is the profitability for charge point operators comes through the throughput of electrons, the kilowatt hours, not so much how many bays they have. So you can have 8 bays, but if you have only one cabinet that's only rated to say 200 kilowatts, then essentially when people plug in, everyone's charge rate comes down to a really small amount. And so when they sit there for half an hour, 40 minutes, they're not getting much of a charge. And so you do end up having to put double cabinet, triple cabinet in. So you are still paying for a bigger grid connection and a bigger central cabinet. And so the economics are better. They are better, but they're not as they're not so much.
They're not as better as we would like.
That's right.
And you mentioned this other point, really, which is that a charger, from a consumer's point of view, just thinking about it, oftentimes consumers are advertised as, like 150 kilowatt or 200. And we all know that, in fact, as soon as sometimes you don't get that in any case, but as soon as another car turns up, it drops to half that or whatever. I don't know. I mean, the charging companies don't really advertise that point, do they?
No, I think they say things like up to 150, up to 200. The reality is that if you actually sit down and think about how to communicate this to consumers, it's incredibly difficult. Like, you actually wouldn't be able to tell them at any given point in time what their likely charge rate is, because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you do attempt to give them a charge rate and it's not that charge rate, they'll say you've lied. And if you don't, then they'll say you're being too vague. And so I think it is quite difficult. Look, I actually think that this is something that's going to be solved with technology in the future, especially as we improve the charging speeds. I actually think it's going to be solved through that. But for the moment, it's very frustrating to rock up to a 150 kilowatt, 200 kilowatt charger, have 3 other vehicles plugged in, so you're only getting 50. I get it. It's just,
that's assuming you can plug in, because
that's assuming you can plug
because it's still, the fact is that the vast majority of sites, if they're non-Tesla sites, are like 1 or 2 bays. And in my experience, unfortunately, because of tritium, is that a significant percentage of the time, one of those bays won't be working at all. And so you drive your 300 kilometers and you basically know you have to leave enough in reserve. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down on that. Let me just talk about grid infrastructure. If you're a charging operating company, I mean, if I look at it in California, for instance, I think it is, there's a requirement on the utility that if a charging company wants to build something, they have to provide the grid infrastructure. I'm probably misstating what actually is, but talk to me about the status of the grid infrastructure along the road networks in terms of charging.
Yeah, so a lot of charging companies will talk about the grid operators being, I guess, a blocker to putting in charging infrastructure. I think about it in a more holistic way, which is that everything is electrifying and everything requires the grid. And electric vehicle charging is one of those things. And as a result, I don't think it's so much about I think there's very few people out there who would claim that the networks are deliberately sabotaging the build out of charging infrastructure. I think it's more just that they are dealing with a high level of electrification across all facets, and EV charging just happens to be caught in the middle of that. There is no doubt that getting a grid connection is the number one thing that delays a project.
So if I wanted to put up if I'm operating a petrol station on the Hume Highway, just for argument, or Sydney to Brisbane around Grafton, this comes to my mind, and I want to build my charging station, and I put my grid in, I guess it'll be to Essential. How long am I going to take to get it approved or whatever?
If no grid augmentation needs to require, which basically means there's enough capacity on the feeder lines, you can just basically put in a new distribution transformer. Then anywhere between 4 to 12 months, right? It just depends on how busy the grid operator is. If you are trying to draw a large load, so let's just call it 1 megawatt, 1.5 megawatts, 2 megawatts, and it requires an actual upgrade to any part of the grid infrastructure, being the feeder lines, or you have to drag new lines, or you have to upgrade the local sub or whatever, that can drag on beyond a year. We've had projects, and I know colleagues who've had projects that have gone out to 2 years because they're requesting really heavy loads. So look, it does delay it by a lot.
And sorry, Tim, just to finish on that, and And the charging operator will be responsible for paying for that capex?
So there's basically a legislated formula of how much the distribution networks will contribute to the build out of the infrastructure. But yes, the charge point operator is responsible for paying the remaining. Yep.
And we're going to come on to charging speeds now. But I guess one lead into it is via this infrastructure. It seems to me that a modern charging station is going to want at least a megawatt of input. The way I'm building them in on main roads, and maybe even more. And I'm thinking about, 5 bays at 200 or 10 bays at 100 or something. Well, let's start by talking about charging speeds. If you're designing a network for the cars that are going to be around in 10 years' time, what do you think the median charging speed should be?
I think charging speeds need to be minimum 150 to 200 kilowatts. That's my view. For a dedicated charging site that's not a destination charger. So we've got customers who are supermarkets, for example, and they'll have a lower charging speed because they want to give people time to go into the supermarket and to do their shop, right? You don't want people rushing out with their trolley because their car's fully charged. So, destination charging to one side, but if it's a dedicated charging hub, I think it needs to be minimum 150 to 200 kilowatts. I do think that in the near future, when I say near, I mean like within the next 3 to 4 years, that we will start approaching 500, 600, 700, 800 kilowatts of charging for passenger vehicles. That, however, is not going to be drawn from the grid. It'll be drawn from battery storage. And so if I were to make a new application today, I probably still do 1 to 1.5 megawatts, but the charging speed, I don't think will be limited to 1 to 1.5 megawatts. I think it will be much, much higher than that because it'll be augmented by battery storage.
Yes. So, I mean, that's you have like a 2 megawatt hour battery or something on there, or some battery that can deliver the power and then recharges when overnight when there's less cars charging. The concept's fairly simple and straightforward. Is it actually been, I think there's a couple of projects in West Australia that might do that or something, but is it been much used here in the NEM area?
So I want to distinguish between two things. So the stuff that's happened in WA and some of the stuff that we've done with NRMA, for example, putting battery storage is more about support, not so much about charging speed, but like about support because of poor grid infrastructure in that area. What I'm saying in the future is that even with healthy grid infrastructure and you're able to get your 1 to 1.5 megawatts, you still want battery storage in there to boost charging speeds. What they're doing in China, for example, which is the bellwether for charging infrastructure globally, is that you've got companies like BYD, CATL, NEO, all promoting battery integrated super fast charging. So charging at between 700 kilowatts to a megawatt. Not off like the big truck charging standard, but just off typical like CCS2. And what they do is typically they use the same batteries that they have in the vehicles and they put it into the stationary storage unit. So you've got stationary storage that is capable of discharging anywhere between like 5, 6 to 10 C and like pumping out all of this juice, which basically means you're getting a full charging under 5 minutes.
Yes, or pretty quickly. In fact, we know that as it speeds up and tapers down, and depending on the battery temperature. Anyway, I don't want to get into the technical side of things,
Sure.
Except to this would have to be lithium LFP batteries, I think, almost for sure. The only thing I think about the charging speeds, as someone that's worked with lithium batteries in model planes and things for many years now, since they invented pretty much, is that you've got to cool down your charging lead. I mean, I know with the megawatt charging standard, you have to have water cooling or something along the power line. What about for these car fast charging?
What's been demonstrated by the charging stations that have actually been rolled out in China, so BYD have rolled out over 5,000 of these battery-supported charging stations already, is that they've got there's a video on YouTube, you can watch it, it's really good. But they basically use the same cooling systems that they use in their high performance vehicles inside the charging station. So you don't have to have the same level of downtime. And without going to the technical parts of it, I think the big question it raises for the charging industry, and it has implications for EV drivers, is what kind of sites do you design if you're able to fully charge a vehicle in pretty much the same time as a petrol vehicle, because all of the sites currently of 10 to 12 bays have been designed around the concept it takes at least 15 to 20 minutes for people to charge up. But if people are able to, and we're not talking 0 to 97%, because most people don't charge that much. Most people come in the station about 30% and then they charge up till about 80% and then they leave. If most people are only spending 2 to 3 minutes per charging session, how does that impact on your site design? How does that impact on your economics? And what kind of grid application do you make? Those are the kind of things that we're going through right now as a charging industry and deciding what kind of sites we want to do.
It is interesting because your point, I straight away think, is that cars are designed to park against a curb, whereas petrol stations are designed left to right, if I can put it that way, drive in, drive out. So there's a lot of things to think about, but we're not really there yet in terms of doing that on the East Coast here in Australia, are we?
We certainly have no examples of it going live. So there have been some announcements by people like Denza who want to have 3 of these sites live in Australia by the end of the year. Regardless of whether it happens this year or next year, my view is that within the next 3 to 5 years, these systems will be, because you can imagine, once people basically are able to charge their car in 3 minutes, that's all they want. They don't want 15 minutes. They don't want 20 minutes. They want to charge in 3 minutes.
But they don't want to have to drive to Wollongong when they live in Hornsby, if I can put it that way, to get on the charging station.
Yes, I completely agree. Look, I think it's a really important thing for long road trips and stuff like that. I think it's less important in urban areas, but might be important for commercial drivers and Uber drivers and stuff like that.
We'll get there. What about how much does it add to cost to do that?
We don't have costings on it at the moment, but you do have to pay for the battery storage. So I imagine it's more expensive per system compared to the charging systems that we see today. However, the utilization for these systems should be much, much higher because you can get a higher number of vehicles per port per day, depending on the size of the battery storage, of course.
And then you've also got to build the cars that are capable of doing it, because
yes.
I want to say that, I've got 800-volt architecture in both of my cars, but I reckon the average car that's not a Tesla would probably struggle to get up to 150 kilowatts max charging speed.
Which is why it's interesting that in China, the 3 companies that are developing these super fast charging systems are either battery and car manufacturers themselves, being BYD and NIO, or they're battery manufacturers like CATL, whose batteries are in 50% of electric vehicles.
I just want to, if you were providing advice to our good buddy Chris Bowen about, or to a state minister about, I think there's a federal EV strategy review due at the back end of this year. And if we all thought that charging infrastructure was a pretty big deal and that Australia's behind, but now we have an opportunity to build we've got a clearer view of what's coming than we perhaps had 5 years ago. Would you mandate standards, distribution approval times? What's the right way to go?
I definitely mandate standards. I basically have a look at focus areas, what's going to make the biggest impact. I think mandating distribution network standards, I'll leave to other people to do because I think that's a long road and it's very hard. But in terms of charging infrastructure, yes, I think there should be standards. I think there should be reliability standards. I think there should be interoperability standards. And I think
interoperability. I mean, every new EV driver, and I just told you, look at banks. They all started out with their own ATMs, but it is shocking that you've got to download 5 different apps and put your credit card details in 5 times. So why can't you just tap and pay? I mean, what's the actual problem with it right now?
So there's a few things here. The first is that tap and pay, so just credit card payment, is being mandated in some government programs. So it's like New South Wales, they have a bunch of charging programs. If you want to get money from them, it has to have tap and pay. I think it is becoming more and more common among public charging operators. So that's the good news. The bad news is that for a market the size of Australia, which is still very, very small compared to globally, we have an incredible number of software providers and app providers because everybody has decided that they want to essentially get customer information. They want to be able to, see what the customer's doing. They want to be able to promote things to the customer, sometimes for legitimate reasons, sometimes just because they want to. And I think it's good for the customer sometimes, but a lot of the time I just say to myself, we just got to make the experience easy. And
that's
at the
another
moment,
complaint
it's not
from
easy.
my wife. I hate to keep bringing her into the conversation, and but she worries about going on a long trip because of all the apps that she's going to have to download and details, and you're standing there and you want to go to the bathroom and you're trying to fiddle with some app that you haven't used before.
Yes. This is not going to be consolation to any EV drivers right now, but history shows and global experience shows that every major global market has started out exactly how Australia has started out. And despite, I have to say, my best efforts, I have been unable to, I guess, get everyone to see what's happening globally and to learn from their mistakes. And so we're going down the same path as everyone has. Lots of different apps. Before people realize that having lots of different apps is silly, nobody's making any money, it starts consolidating. Then you have roaming. Then you have roaming apps. If you have a look at a company like ChargeFox, for example, they're signing roaming agreements now. So we're going down exactly the same path as the rest of the world. My hope is that because of the mandate that the government has had on certain programs for tap and pay, just basically like credit card, I think most people will just be able to pay by credit card. And certainly, I came to a charger where I didn't have the app during my road trip and I just used a credit card. It was great. And then for everyone else who wants to use an app for whatever reason, they might get a discount. It might integrate with the electricity provider. They can, and there should be a smaller number of apps.
Frequent user points, yes.
Yes, well,
there's a whole industry you can build around that, Tim, in case you didn't know.
Yeah, no, I think I'm too tired to build anything else. But I think if I were to, coming back to the federal government, if I were to advise on two focus areas, I think the first is to expand the number of existing charging sites where they only have one charging station and provide a grant program specifically to expand the number of car bays. Because the reality is that the CPOs who've come in, and by the way, it's not only CPOs now, there's actually lots of site owners who are setting up their own charging networks because they want to offer a great customer experience to their own customers. So whoever you are, the public charging side, if you have existing sites, chances are you've picked those existing sites for a reason. It's because you think those are good sites that people will use it. And so, but if you only have 2 car bays, it's not enough to service the modern EV fleet. So I would focus on expanding those rather than trying to create new sites. And then the second thing I would do is focus on the regional areas where utilization will never break even for the charge point operator and ensure that the government has a role in basically creating and maintaining those charging stations, because there will be some areas, right, where regardless of how many EVs we have, certainly for the next 10 years, it'll never break even because it won't get used enough, but it might unlock a critical part, a critical town. It might improve that community resilience, so I think it's important for the government to focus on that as well, like a black spot program, but for chargers.
Yep, got it. Let's move on to the truck side of things. And I think there's been so much publicity about the way Australia is very diesel intensive. We use more diesel than we use petrol. Most of the diesel is used in the mining industry, which is not the subject of this talk today. The diesel is certainly used a lot in the trucking industry, and we hear endlessly about the small truck owner who went broke yesterday and can't possibly afford to buy an EV truck, and even if he could, there's nowhere to charge it. And then I turn around and look at Lindsay Fox or whatever and wonder exactly that's not the only example in the industry. That's where you're working now. I mean, I've got my own views about long distance trucking, and I've said that I'm an investor in new energy transport. I just need to disclose. But how are you seeing the truck charging infrastructure evolving, and what's the role for private and public sector there?
I think when it comes to trucks, the industry as well as ordinary punters fall into the same trap as we've had with EVs, which is that we largely ignore the easy to electrify part of the fleet, and we only concentrate on the hardest to electrify part of the fleet. And so I think a lot of the focus has been on interstate transport. And obviously, that is a huge thing that we need to solve.
That's where a lot of the diesel's consumed. And so that's, for me, when you look at it from the truck owner's perspective, that's where the economics are, because the more kilometres you go, and it's also where the diesel save. It's the Australian interest, but it's not the easy to electrify part. I get that.
Yeah, it's hard to electrify because, as you would be aware, basically getting a business case up for, share charging infrastructure between Melbourne and Sydney or Sydney and Brisbane, it's difficult right now because there aren't enough trucks on the road. Where we've been focusing has been on two sectors. The first is last mile delivery. And you could say that, yes, on average, a rigid truck that goes 100 Ks a day is not the same as a prime mover that goes 600 Ks a day. I agree with that. But there's also a lot more of them. And so for a lot of our customers, we've got this huge hoo-ha about how we have to promote activity. But actually for a lot of our customers, we already operate large numbers of last mile delivery trucks that are business as usual for our customers. We build the depots, we operate them, they rely on them on a daily basis. And
can you give me a few numbers that would help me understand what you've already achieved?
Yeah, sure. So a good and well-publicized example is IKEA. So IKEA, for those of you who don't know, have a global mandate for emissions-free delivery. They're a very progressive business, a very sustainability focused, and Australia did not escape that. Australia has to be part of the same program. IKEA essentially has a number of companies that work with them to deliver flat pack furniture. You see those IKEA trucks all around. And so they essentially had to work out a way to turn all of those trucks electric. And what they realized was that it was going to be a hard ask to go to all of these providers, and some of these providers are smaller providers, subcontractors of subcontractors, to electrify their trucks without charging infrastructure. So they worked with JetCharge to basically electrify a lot of their depots, and we put in the charging infrastructure to electrify these trucks. I can't remember exactly how many trucks, but what I can say is that now, today, 97% of all IKEA deliveries are made using electric trucks. And so next time you see an IKEA truck, it's probably electric that's delivering it. And that's a good example of someone that's doing it business as usual.
And you've put the charging infrastructure in it, the IKEA truck depots, I presume, but as you say, IKEA doesn't operate all the trucks. So how have you gone about where to locate stuff?
Yeah. So they the best thing to do with logistics is not to try and change too much behavior. That's my personal view.
No. It's been worked out very nicely for a reason.
Yeah, that's right. And so the trucks are basically going where they've always gone, which is they park at these IKEA depots to load up on the furniture and the stores. And they park there and they charge up almost, it's like a semi-private network where essentially, they're just charging using IKEA's charging infrastructure. But the most important thing is that IKEA were the ones who took the step, made the investment to implement the infrastructure. So their partners had the confidence to transition at scale. And so just think of it as like a public charging network, but only restricted to IKEA partners.
I can think about that very easily. And how do the economics look, both from the truck owners? The truck owners still have to buy their electric trucks, don't they?
Mm.
And
they do. But the truck prices have come down dramatically, and I can't speak because of various confidentiality. I can't speak specifically on the IKEA example, but I can say that on both prime movers and rigids, there are definitely a set of circumstances, even today, at pre-war diesel prices, where the truck operator comes out on top when compared to their diesel use. So not for every fleet, that'll come. But right now, a significant amount of the fleet across prime movers in particular, but also including some rigid trucks doing last mile delivery, where if you add up the cost premium of the truck, the charging infrastructure, the maintenance cost for the infrastructure in the truck, and the electrons that flow through it, there's a significant number of businesses that would be able to pay for all of that and still have an economic advantage compared to what they pay for diesel at pre-war diesel prices. So what's happening is that it's actually becoming an economic decision for a lot of these companies, not necessarily an environmental one.
Yes, and the keys there are that the actual cost of the trucks is coming down. I guess that's partly a scale thing. and it's partly the underlying battery costs coming down as well. But it still doesn't work unless the truck can charge. So that's okay if you're an IKEA truck, but for most, have we seen examples beyond that? Is it spreading? What's the growth rate like? I suppose.
Yeah, so it is spreading. I think no one's cracked interstate transport, which is, I guess, where New Energy Transport and other companies are trying to solve that issue. And others are looking at battery swap to solve that issue rather than charging. But as of today, no one's cracked interstate truck charging. However, there's actually a significant amount of the fleet that do hundreds of kilometers, between 400 to 600 kilometers per day, but they do a loop and go back to their depot.
That's right.
And so we've been focusing on those. And that's been very successful.
So would your business in that area, the charging business, be growing every year?
Yes, absolutely. And our model...
Are we talking like 20% growth? 30%. You could just you tell me whatever numbers you want to talk about, Tim. But it's nice to talk numbers to some extent.
Yeah, I would say that if I look at our truck charging business, it grows at significantly more than 20% per year. I actually don't know the numbers off the top of my head in terms of exactly what it is, but it's seeing great growth. And I'll tell you it's for two reasons. The first is that end customers for these logistics providers are demanding it. So I'm talking the big box retailers. They are demanding that their providers have a sustainability plan and a transition plan for their logistics. The key driver behind that is that these big companies are required to report on their Scope 3 emissions at the board level, and it has to be audited, which means that they are asking their subcontractor drivers, it's counted in their Scope 3 emissions. So they're actually releasing tenders that say, if you do not have this transition plan, or if you don't plan to buy electric trucks, you will not win this work, even if you are the cheapest. And so people are starting to transition. And I think that's one of the drivers of growth. And I think the other driver of growth is, yes, the Middle East war has had an effect on the mindset of logistics businesses.
I think it's so true. Even if they're not going to do it this year, people aren't going to forget in a big hurry.
Well, they're going to look, right? My biggest thing is I just need someone to look and investigate for a couple of weeks, right? Because I know that once they do that, they will be surprised at the economics. Ultimately, JetCharge as a business and our entire industry cannot rely on good sentiment and sustainability to drive wide adoption. It has to rely on economics. Our challenge is that we have people who've done things a certain way for decades and won't even look at the opportunity because they just think it won't work for whatever reason. But as soon as they start looking at the opportunity, they go, wow, okay, not for the entire fleet, but certainly for this portion, this will work and it makes commercial sense to us. And that's where we've seen the biggest growth since the war in the Middle East, is that people have started looking. And I have to basically commend also the Australian government for, they've done through like ARENA and through Clean Energy Finance Corporation, they've done an incredible amount of business development work, reaching out to all of the logistics operators going, hey guys, you should look at this. These are the economics. Like, they've actually done a lot of that work for the industry. So that's generated a lot of activity.
Tim, we're running out of time here, but I want to give you some space for any comments or thoughts. I guess let's just talk about this. I take it within the cities, you're most likely to be able to find your truck charging infrastructure. We've talked about the economics of the trucks improving. What about the actual equipment for the charging? Is that, that should get an economies of scale kind of benefit, and the network operators should get better at, all the bits and pieces. I mean, the whole industry should be on the virtuous part of the cycle, shouldn't it?
Look, I think it depends. I think different parts of the industry are at different points of their journey. I think even though us and a couple of others have been doing this for a really long time, the reality is that the vast majority of businesses in this country dealing with charging infrastructure are new. Just like the vast majority of EV companies are new. And so, companies adopting EVs are new. And so what that means is that from an infrastructure perspective, most of the businesses in this space are focused on selling charging infrastructure and treating it as a hardware business. But what we know is that to have a robust charging infrastructure landscape really,
you have to have after-sales service.
You have to have after sales, but more importantly than that, I guess JetCharge, we focus on critical infrastructure sites. So we run bus depots, truck depots, and large-scale public charging sites. Uptime, but also sometimes things just go wrong. And that's like, things go wrong. And it's actually nobody's fault. It could be a confluence of circumstances that make things go wrong. And do you have, because everyone will market, oh, well, we've got 24/7 coverage, but is your 24/7 coverage some poor Sparky?
Tim, I've heard it.
You've heard it before.
I believe you 100%.
Great.
And I'm sure it's a characteristic of every successful business that when a friend in need is a friend indeed, is what it boils down to, that you're there when they need you.
Yeah, and I think my greatest reflection on the charging infrastructure landscape as it comes now is that, yes, I think the economics are improving. Yes, I do think public charging operators are making significant amounts of profit on their best sites. But for the industry as a whole, I think there's still a long way to go before we realize and are capable of dealing with the responsibility that we're about to be given. I actually think that the responsibility of the industry to sustain critical infrastructure for this country is actually not appreciated by the vast majority of companies in our field. And I think that's going to come home to roost in the next 10 years unless we kind of pull up our pants and get it done.
That's great, Tim. And you make me think of tritium again as an example of how one thing that goes wrong, perhaps for no one's reason, ends up costing the whole industry a lot. Thanks so much for sharing. It was very clear explanation and discussion, and I very much appreciate your time. Thanks again.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
That was JetCharge's Tim Washington. We'll be back after this short break.
Australian Energy Week is taking place in Melbourne, June 9th to 12th. With the free Expo Pass, you can walk the expo floor, see live demos, and catch 12 plus hours of expert sessions on the Insight stage, all included with your complimentary pass. The expo brings generators, networks, retailers, renewables developers, and BESS specialists all under one roof, showcasing the technologies and solutions driving the energy transition forward. Whether you're sourcing new suppliers, evaluating emerging technologies, or simply staying ahead of a rapidly shifting industry, the Expo gives you direct access to the people and products shaping the future of energy in Australia. To get your free Expo Pass, visit www.energyweek.com.au/visit-the-expo.
You're back with the Energy Insiders podcast with Giles Parkinson and David Leach. We do have a lot to get through, David. Just your main takeaways, though, with Tim's interview. What struck you most out of that?
Well, I think, speaking as an analyst, the thing that struck me is how fast Tim's the electric truck charging business is going. The intra, that is within a city type business, seems to be rapidly expanding. He said it was growing faster than 20% a year. And then there were the recommendations, which I think we all know if we look at cars, and Tim spoke to them quite clearly, so I'm not going to repeat them right now because there's so much else to get through. We're going to get to the NCAT interview in a minute, but I think the most exciting news of the week, even more exciting than our interviews, was the release of the latest CIS tender, which some might see as boring, but in fact it contained a few grains of truth beyond the headlines, didn't it?
Look, there's some interesting stuff there. So it ended up being about 7.9 gigawatts, which is more than the 5 gigawatts that they were seeking, and I guess that's not surprising. The big headline there was the scale of some of the projects. There's 19 winners overall, and the reason why it got to 7.9 gigawatts is that there was 3 gigawatt scale projects. So Yanco Delta, Bungaban, which has got a PPA with Rio Tinto, and you'd think would be almost certain to go ahead, and sometime
It's a very
soon.
expensive project, that one, Giles. It's not easy to get going, that.
Well, if they've got a PPA with Rio Tinto for 90% of their output, and now they've got an underwriting agreement with the government, you'd think they'd be able to get across the line somehow. If they can't, then I guess all those plans are gone.
But I've interrupted you, Giles, and you were going to mention the third project, and also what to me was the exciting part about the announcement was the expectation that up to 3 projects are actually going to get to FID this year.
This year or early next year, yeah. So that third project was the Theodore wind project, which is owned by RWE, the German energy giant, which incidentally just announced today that it's got the country's first 8-hour battery up and running, which is good. RWE made it quite clear they expect to reach FID by the end of this year or very early next year. I checked in with Origin Energy about Yanco Delta, and they said pretty much the same thing. They had around to get equity partners for that, but they've got a buyer. They know who the buyer is because it's them. So if they can get the equity lined up, then that's good. I'd expect Bungapan to line up FID as well. It's got to get back through the approvals process because it's made some changes. And then you've also got Liverpool Range, and the indication I was getting from Tilt Renewables was that was also, late this year, early next year type of arrangement. So we could have 3, potentially more gigawatt scale wind projects.
And then we'll test how well all the planning's going, because if you've got like 4 gigawatts of wind being built at once, and you want to get it built in so many years, and that's so many turbines that have to come into the dock every week and get through the road systems that have basically struggled to get 2 turbines a week in through any state. But I think there's been a lot of planning for this, and I don't think it's impossible, but let's wait. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. And Giles, the point I'm
just going to mention a couple of other things. There are a lot of solar hybrid projects in this in this tender win. The selected ones, there was 2 sort of solar only, but they're actually going to have batteries anyway, but didn't pitch the battery into the actual tender. And interestingly enough, 2 of the wind projects came with batteries, and Rachel Williamson and Sophie Vora from Renew Economy went along to the wind energy conference in Melbourne this week, and battery storage was a major theme of that conference. That's really interesting to see how the wind developers are now thinking about batteries and seeing that as an almost essential part of their project makeup. They still got to cut and slice it to make money out of it, but it's interesting to see, and that's going.
And I think, there's been a debate for a year now. Do we even need wind projects? Can't we do it all with solar and batteries? I'm simply here to say I've done been working 2 weeks now on a model that I've been working on and off for 3 or 4 years. And it doesn't matter how you cut it, but even with wind at $3.5 million a megawatt right out to 2045, you still end up in your model with lots of wind as being the lowest cost way of servicing the system. So we do need the wind, and the sooner we get started on it, the less of a problem we'll have when the coal stations actually come to close. Even if Queensland runs the coal a bit more than is assumed in the ISP, another 5 years, say, there's still going to be a heck of a hump in the 2030s to get over. And so we've really got to get on with the building of stuff. Chris Bowen, 80% by 82% by 2030 was absolutely the right idea, even if the execution needs a lot of teamwork, which in some cases is more evident in its absence.
Yeah, and I still think we'll actually get closer than many people think. And it was interesting that Minister Bowen was talking this week about data centres and the influence they have actually in signing PPAs. Because basically what we've seen over the last couple of years, as you well know, David, is basically a buyer's strike by corporate buyers and by the utilities themselves. So it's going to be interesting to see if the data centres do actually produce anything. Although I do know that AEMO CEO Daniel Westerman was kind of downplaying the data center in the sense that people talk about all these multiple gigawatts of applications, but he did note that some of them are actually doubling up or tripling up because they're testing which network they want to join. And a lot of them will actually be rolled out slowly because a bit like a big battery, you kind of build it all in stages. So it's not as though we're suddenly going to get hit by 5
As
gigawatts.
I mentioned, it's not even the electricity or even the grid connection that's necessarily the bottleneck for a data center. It's the equipment itself. You can't I don't know if you probably don't follow the share markets like some of us do, Giles, but some of these memory manufacturers, there's only 3 in the world, and their share prices are up hundreds of % this year as the demand has absolutely rocketed. And if when you go down to buy your next power bank for your computer or something, you're going to be paying more. Your phones struggle to stay at the same price because random access memory module prices are pretty high at the moment.
Yeah. And look, the other thing I wanted to mention too was that at the Energy and Inefficiency Conference, I was there for 2 days. It was kind of interesting. Michael Liebrecht, the founder of, the founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, was talking. He's a very good communicator. He famously released the hydrogen
Ladder.
The ladder, that's right, and has now just released the electrification step ladder, I think it's called, and that's really interesting. He's a great presenter and communicator. The thing that struck me most about what he said was just about the net zero and how people have used that and immediately gone to, we can't get to net zero by whatever date because zero is really hard, and they fret about all the hardest things. And I think we've seen this in our own political debate and sort of economic debate when they sort of kind of ignore all the easiest thing. And there's so much that can be done, which is actually really quite easy. And energy efficiency and demand management has kind of been, talked about for so long, not much happening. He had a lot of really interesting slides about how much we can achieve with electrification, how much we can achieve quite cheaply with electrification. And on that same note, the other thing I sat in a few sessions about this new demand statement of opportunities, which is a collaboration between the AEMO, CSIRO, and other people, a bit like the electricity statement of opportunities.
Well, the CSIRO still got some people left, has it?
A couple, yes. And they're good people. So like the electricity statement of opportunities, which is all about, what do we need to build to supply? The demand statement of opportunities is, how much can we save and how much can we avoid by actually being really smart about sort of big energy user demand, household demand, and things like that. And I think that's a really important part.
It's an interesting topic, Giles, but it's kind of runs against the grain in two ways. One, I think energy should be plentiful, and we can be in Australia. That's a sort of philosophical thing, but more practically, as I mentioned on the podcast last week, data centers have this 99.94% uptime. So if data centers become 10 or 15% that's a lot higher than an aluminium smelter, right?
Yeah, that's right. But guess what? Guess what's going to be using 3 times more energy than demand data centers, or at least 4 times more energy, and that's going to be electric vehicles. And electric vehicles, you can actually charge them smartly.
If 100% of it was all converted to, and they can give back as well. But, so there's a lot of things there. Take into account a lot of that in our modelling. Now, the other thing that came through this week, which will be no surprise to anyone who follows what's been going on, is the fact that BHP and Rio wasn't in this particular thing, but they really walked back any carbon commitments. And I don't know how people actually work at these companies when their bosses, I don't want to be too strong about it, but it reminds me of the tobacco industry. These guys have, in my opinion, something of a duty to show some leadership if they want to be Australia's leading corporate citizens. Now, I say that for BHP, it's Australia's biggest taxpayer, corporate income taxpayer, and to that extent, they're entitled to have a view about anything they want. They pay for a heck of a lot of stuff with all their taxes and royalties, and Rio pays for a lot as well. But it doesn't really excuse you from your obligations, to put it in a hand-on-heart way to the future generations and stuff, and to do your bit.
No, that's right. And I'd actually probably point out, you don't know how many people worked there. And I think some of the people that were actually working on their decarbonisation plans are no longer working there because they've gotten frustrated and found better and greener fields. And look, it was actually quite useful for the ABC to highlight the juxtaposition between BHP and Fortescue. I think it's probably given that sort of diesel rebate issue a kick on the road. And
Mike Henry from BHP, who's departing, has been going on in this past year about high energy prices in Australia, and I think the head of BHP Steel's has been saying pretty much the same thing. But it's utter bullshit. When you do the actual work, Australian energy prices are not that high, and this is what irritates me, that our biggest leaders can just come out with so much absolute garbage. But anyway...
well, that's right. And that's all about them trying to say, well, the technology is not there, but Fortescue is saying, well, it is there, and they are rolling it out, and that's fantastic. And over the last week, they've actually announced the start of the biggest solar farm outside of the main grid, Turner River, another 650 megawatt hour, 6 hour battery. No, it's an 8 hour battery, which is, they're actually sort of moving along, and they fitted out their first electric haul truck, 260 tons, with their own equipment. They're starting their 6 megawatt.
They're doing a bit.
They're doing it. So yeah,
we have to get on to our second interview, but I just wanted to finish, Giles, on this point. and the reason I mention it more than any is because it goes to trust. One of the one of the reasons that happen is people who feel they've been left out by the whole thing. And one thing that happens is they don't trust what the leadership says very much. And when the leadership says things that are demonstrably wrong, whether it's a corporate level, a social level, or a political level, that helps to break down that trust that is, in my opinion, one of the strong fabrics of our society. Anyway, enough of that stuff. And
just to sort of pick up, I think you're absolutely right, David. But look, just to pick up on the thread of showing that technology is here. One of the things that we hardly know is this story about Incat. It's Tasmania has been building ferries for God knows how many years, decades. They've become quite expert in lightweight boats and lightweight shipping. That's proved to be their advantage in conversion to battery storage. And the story that Anne Delaney has gotten on the Switched On podcast, and we also published in the New Economy this week, is really quite fascinating. She's got this wonderful video taking us through the 40 megawatt hour battery that's on the ship. And just the story of Robert Clifford. He's 83 years old. He can sort of see the future. He's got a great vision about how much can be built. So just before we go, the last thing we do before we go is to sort of play this clip, just 5 minutes, and just to give you a bit of a taste of the interview.
It is very much a turning point. Speed is only one ingredient, of course. Lightweight is the other very serious ingredient that we've been very good at. Lightweight has meant we've built fast ships in the past, but it also means we can build more economical ships now when speed is not quite so urgently required. And of course, electricity, or whichever form of power you use, needs a lot of energy to drive the ship. If you drive it at 20 knots, you need an awful lot less energy than you do at 40 knots, whether that's diesel or petrol or electricity. But we're looking at a much bigger market now than we've ever had before. We are now big enough to replace many conventional steel ships. Those steel ships, if they were to go electric, will need a massive amount of electricity because they are much, much heavier ships. And typical English Channel crossing, for example, it doesn't really matter whether you do 20 knots or 25 knots. It still only takes like an hour to get across. So the efficiency of the lightweight electric ship is very, very high on the agenda.
So the fact that Incat has been dealing with and manufacturing aluminium ships for some time, that's made you, put you in a great place to actually make the shift to electric?
Absolutely correct. To keep it in perspective, just imagine going to any of the aircraft manufacturers and say, we like what you do, but please build it out of steel. We all understand that wouldn't work. The airplane wouldn't fly. Well, the ships are very, very similar. If it's a third the weight, it's about a third the power required to move it, and that's so important with electricity.
So just tell me about this ship that we're sitting in right now. How big is it? Give my listeners a sense of what you've achieved here with this vehicle.
Well, this ship is 130 metres long. It's what we call Panamax. That means that it still fits the Panama Canal, 31 metres and a bit wide. It carries 2,100 passengers, 225 or so cars, and it would have a speed of about 25 knots, and it will deliver its customers across the River Plate in about an hour on the journey that they're intending, and will do something like 6 to 8 return crossings a day. So, and it's got a massive duty-free shop on board as well, so to keep them occupied while they're on that 1 hour journey.
And also, I presume, to make some money for Book Your Bus.
Well, it's very important that he makes money, and of course he does make a very large part of his income out of the duty-free. And that's great for us because we like to take it from him.
Tell me what sort of an engineering challenge this vehicle was.
The ship itself is quite relatively simple for us. It's a lightweight aluminium ship. The machinery, the water jets we're using are very similar to what we've used in the past. The electric motors are new, the switchboards are new, the batteries are new. They're not.
So you've had to develop these new systems in order to be able to put them on this electric vehicle?
We have, but in conjunction with the suppliers, of course. The electrical suppliers have worked very closely with us with all of those items. But we've had to put it together. Electric ships as such are not new. Many of the cruise ships are electric powered, for instance, but the electricity is made with diesel engines turning generators. We're replacing those generators with batteries. So it's not so much that electric is new, it's that the battery electric is new.
What has changed technologically and also economically to make an electric vehicle of this size, and it will be the largest, I understand, in the world, electric maritime vehicle? What's made it possible?
The batteries have been improving rapidly over the last few years. We are using today's known technology. So the batteries we're using today, we fully expect to be better in 4 or 5 years' time, which will give us more and more range. Whereas this ship's only on a 25-mile or 30-mile crossing, it won't be very long before we can do 50 miles, 60 miles, 70 miles, and not too long before we even do 100 miles. The batteries are improving so rapidly that the technology is growing as we grow.
I mean, fast ferries are generally energy intensive. How have you made this, fast and light?
Well, we are going slower than we used to go. This particular ship's only going to be in service at around 25 knots. We've had a number of ships that have been in excess of 50 knots in the past. Well, speed is, as you say, not the most economical way of travel. Coming down to 25 knots takes perhaps only a quarter the power that it takes to do 50 knots.
Right.
So whereas speed is very nice, economics is the driving factor.
And how much of the transition to electric ferries do you think is being driven by climate pressure versus hard commercial realities like fuel costs, regulation, certainly in Europe, and customer demand?
Well, it's a combination of all things, of course. There is an ecological pressure from governments, etc., and financiers. To finance a diesel-powered ship today is very difficult, because the financiers are worried what are you going to do with a ship in 5 or 10 years' time? So the finance industry alone is driving it. Governments are driving it also by putting taxes on diesel fuels, and those taxes are increasing annually to drive the ship customers away from diesel. So it's a combination of things: lightweight, electricity, the economics, and electricity, in most parts of the world at least, is not more expensive than other fuels. As diesel is taxed more and more, these hypothetical fuels like ammonia and hydrogen and all these things we read about are going to be very, very expensive if they are going to be available at all. And all of those fuels take a lot of electricity to make. So why not put that electricity straight into the battery?
And that was Robert Clifford, the chairman of INCAT, talking to Anne Delaney on the Switched On podcast, which you can find either on the website or your favourite podcast platform, or I'd even suggest subscribe, because she has some great interviews with people that we don't get around to interviewing or whatever. So, David, I think that's about it. That's a very full program for today. People have to do a lot of gardening, a lot of washing up, and a lot of driving to schools and back to listen to everything. So, look, thanks everyone for listening in. Thanks to our sponsor, Pylon. We will be back with another episode of the Energy Insiders podcast next week. And goodbye for now.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.